So we now have a podium presentation from Prashanth Velayudhan, who is going to be speaking. Read their title. And Prashanth is a third-year PhD student in Dr. Ann Wheeler's lab in the Neurosciences and Mental Health program at Hospital for Sick Kids and Department of Physiology at U of T. His research focuses on applying computational methods to better understand the heterogeneity of concussion.
Okay, hi. So my project is titled Biopsychosocial Subtypes of Pediatric Concussion Predict Behavioral Impairment. So pediatric concussion is highly prevalent, so it affects approximately 15% of children in Ontario every year. It can lead to very diverse outcomes, cognitive, somatic, or behavioral ones. These outcomes can be very persisting, lasting for months or years after the initial injury. And these outcomes are also very difficult to manage. So treating them or predicting how long they'll last or how severe they'll be is still very difficult to do. And part of this might be because of how immensely heterogeneous pediatric concussion is. We know that injury details, such as how the child got their concussion or what sorts of acute symptoms they experienced immediately after their concussion, can really associate with what sorts of outcomes they might experience. But we've also seen more and more that all sorts of other biopsychosocial factors, such as psychosocial resilience attributes, brain structure and function, medical history, and the child's demographics can also have this complex interplay and shape what sorts of outcomes a kid will develop. So in other heterogeneous disease contexts, subtyping has been used quite successfully to make treatment a little bit more manageable by dividing up diverse populations into more homogeneous subgroups that may respond to treatment similarly or may have more similar trajectories of recovery. And in the context of concussion, many studies have taken a look and tackled this problem of finding subtypes or patient subtypes of concussion. A lot of studies are up here. However, several of these studies have all shared one or two limitations that we're looking to kind of address with this project over here. First, external validation is very uncommon in subtyping work. So often studies will create these patient subtypes, but not have further analyses showing that the key characteristics of these subtypes hold true in patients who weren't a part of the original analysis. Next, a lot of these studies have been restricted to a very narrow scope of input variables, and usually that'll either be due to data set limitations, where data sets just don't have that much diverse information all at once, or due to methodological restrictions. So many clustering algorithms are just not capable of handling very diverse types of data simultaneously. And finally, very few studies have actually taken a look at the pediatric population in terms of subtyping. So this is still a very understudied group here. So we're aiming to derive biopsychosocial subtypes of pediatric concussion, specifically that are very informative for better understanding long-term concussion outcomes. We're making use of the adolescent brain cognitive development study data set, which is this very large data set of over 11,000 9 to 10-year-old children, 9 to 10-year-old kids. This is a community sample, so kids are not specifically recruited on the basis of having had a concussion. They're recruited on the basis of being representative of kids across the United States of America. And a lot of different biopsychosocial attributes are collected about them that I'll go into now. So variables that we are collecting from this data set to use for the cluster analysis include details related to the acute injury, such as if the child experienced a loss of consciousness or felt dazed after their injury, and how they got their injury. Demographic information, including the age at the injury, household income, sex, race, and pubertal status. Medical history information, including if they have a clinical history of having severe headache problems and how many previous concussions they've experienced. as well as a variety of neuroimaging factors, so structural, diffusion, and functional kind of summary brain imaging metrics. And finally, some psychosocial resilience variables, which cover quite a wide range of variables, including things like screen time, exercise time, other healthy habits, child reports of their family environment, and parent psychopathology scores. And all of these will be the inputs for our clustering. We also have a few outcome measures that are not going to be used in the cluster analysis, and these include a variety of different subscales, so 8 different subscales covering somatic, behavioral, and emotional problems coming from the child behavior checklist, as well as total sleeping problems coming from the sleep disturbance scale. Our main clustering tool that we're making use of is this technique called similarity network fusion that enables cluster analysis to happen over very diverse types of data. So the method involves calculating how similar the kids are to each other based on one data type at a time, so maybe just neuroimaging or just demographics. And then the algorithm itself will fuse all those similarity networks together to give you a single matrix describing how similar all the kids are to each other across all the variables you started with. And this technique was developed to really minimize the loss of information that can occur from each individual data type that happens when you try clustering over all sorts of different things using traditional approaches. We're also using a procedure called meta-clustering, and this process was developed to address the issue of how noisy, complex data sets can have many different clustering solutions that are qualitatively very different, but by the numeric metrics are very similar or very comparable in terms of how good they appear. And so it's very difficult as a researcher to sift through all the possible solutions and figure out what is most useful for your specific context. And so this process involves generating a huge number of cluster solutions by tweaking the clustering settings, and then clustering those cluster solutions into a manageable number of meta clusters, which can then be more rigorously characterized by the researcher. And if you're interested or use R in your group, we've developed an R package called MetaSNF that makes it very easy to take raw patient data and get out patient subtypes by just a few different function calls that really combine these two approaches together. So the experimental design that I'm using here is to take the 440 kids in the ABCD study who have had a concussion prior to baseline data collection. 80% of them go through this meta-clustering procedure, and we specifically pick out the meta-cluster that has the best separation of groups across our outcome measures, the ones that weren't involved in the clustering, so that's the child behavior checklist and the sleeping problems. That top meta cluster is characterized. So we check to see, what makes that cluster what it is in terms of how things differ by the input variables. And then we validate our cluster solution by trying to see, do these key characteristics remain true when we map our cluster solution onto kids who were not a part of the actual original analysis. So this is what 2000 cluster solutions can look like. So this is a heat map showing the pairwise similarities of 2000 cluster solutions. And these red squares are the meta clusters. So these are sets of cluster solutions that are all very similar to each other. And they all tell you different things about the data in different interesting ways. But we're focusing on meta cluster A in the top left over here, which happened to be the best one at separating kids apart according to the outcome measures of interest. So just a quick run through of some of the highlights from what makes this cluster what it is. It's a 3-cluster solution where our first cluster is kind of the high impairment cluster. So they are consistently higher than the other 2 clusters on all the different behavioral, somatic, and sleeping problem measures that we have. Interestingly, we see pretty much no difference between these groups on what sorts of acute injury information we have on them. So no difference in how they distribution of how they acquired their injury or whether or not they experienced loss of consciousness or anything like that. However, we do see a lot of separation on demographics. So our high impairment cluster does have the highest proportion of minority groups, kind of indicating this role of systemic discrimination in driving these sorts of high outcome scores. We also see that our high impairment cluster happens to be mostly male, and in the bottom left, and that our high impairment cluster also has the lowest household income by quite a substantial amount in the bottom right. Our other two sort of low impairment clusters are mostly characterized by being a sex split. So the low impairment males are cluster 2 and the low impairment females are cluster 3. Some other important insights about cluster 1 is that they had the highest worst child reports of family environment. So for example, kids consistently report that their homes have the most family fighting going on. And we also see that from parents taking the parent kind of self report on a psychopathology test, is that the parents will have the worst psychopathology scores out of all the clusters. So we wanted to see how many of these kind of attributes held true in kids who weren't involved in the clustering. We're using a method called label propagation, where kids who were not involved in the clustering are kind of assigned a predicted cluster just based on how similar they are to the kids who have already been clustered. And this is just a quick overview of some of the different attributes that really characterized our original cluster solution. And they're highlighted as being green when we see that this pattern really holds very true in our test set as well. And the red ones are ones that weren't quite as strongly seen in our test set. So notably, some of the high impairment attributes, such as the worst family environment and the higher screen time, were trending but not significant in our test set. So we also took a look at matched uninjured controls just to contextualize our results a bit and understand how specific is all this to MTBI. And interestingly, we started with a demographic match group because it seemed like demographics were really driving our heterogeneity. But within a demographic matched uninjured sample, we didn't see anything at all similar to what we observed in our MTBI group. However, when we match on both demographics and outcome levels, so now we're looking at this unusual high impairment subpopulation of the uninjured kids, now we do see qualitatively a cluster solution that was very similar to our MTBI group solution. And so how does this all kind of wrap together? Our takeaway from all this, well, first, we did derive these biopsychosocial subtypes that were very informative of post-concussion outcomes. We found that, at least in our training set, the most important factors, the biggest factors, seem to be related to demographics, parent psychopathology, family environment, and intriguingly, not really details of the MTBI itself. And we also see that it looks like there's this MTBI-like or this concussion-like pattern of heterogeneity that's not actually specific to kids who have a concussion. And so this could be indicative of this subpopulation that when they have this specific structure of heterogeneity, that's really a group that is at a high risk of having an MTBI. So kids who adhere to this sort of structure may be really at risk of developing a new MTBI. It could also be that there's this broader structure to this high impairment group, this other kind of subpopulation that we're seeing, and that sustaining an injury can really steer development towards kids really displaying characteristics of this cluster structure. And that's something we can get at a little bit more with subsequent work in longitudinal data. And then just thank you to my lab and my committee members and the funding sources. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Camilla, there? Go ahead, Miriam. Do you have questions on the chat?
Yeah.
Any? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I think there could be a nutrition factor.
Yeah, I think there could be a nutrition factor. And I think that if we did, my guess on if we did have nutrition is that it would maybe play a role in what we're seeing here as well, because we do see that strong income separation. And I suspect that there's probably going to be a very big association between household income and the quality of nutrition that a child is getting. So that may be kind of what's going on here. The variables we have here, we're not really interpreting necessarily as like, oh, these are the causal things that are going on, but they all kind of share some insights about what is really driving the outcome diversity. And so it could be that nutrition is playing a very big role in all this.
Anything on the chat? I'll have to come back next year and tell us about your progress. Okay, thank you.